The most obvious place to hide on a spaceship, Jake had explained, was the pilot's seat. Everyone expected the pilot to be there, so no one really looked at the pilot. It was a principle he called hiding in plain sight, and Zara was about to see exactly how it worked. Jake had spent the last 20 minutes making modifications to the ship's systems while void hunters surrounded the vessel outside. Now he was sitting in the pilot's chair, wearing a standard flight suit he had found in the ship's locker. To anyone looking through the bridge windows, he would appear to be exactly what he was supposed to be, a desperate human trying to escape in a stolen ship. Zara was crammed into a maintenance compartment behind the pilot's station, where she could see everything through a small viewing port, but would be invisible to anyone outside the ship. It was uncomfortable, but it gave her a perfect view of what was about to happen. "Remember," Jake said quietly, "when they board the ship, don't move, don't breathe loudly, and don't panic. They're going to be focused on what they think they're finding, not on what might actually be there." The Void Hunters were making their final preparations for boarding. Zara could see them through the bridge windows, checking their weapons and positioning their troops. Their leader was speaking into a communication device, probably reporting to their ship that the humans were about to be captured. "What exactly are they going to find when they board?" Zara asked. "A ship with an active pilot who appears to be trying to escape," Jake said. "Emergency escape pods that show life signs indicating hidden passengers. And a cargo bay full of what their sensors will tell them are extremely valuable prisoners, but the cargo bay is full of explosives. Mining charges emit very similar energy signatures to life support systems," Jake explained, "especially when they're connected to timer circuits and proximity sensors. To their scanners, it will look like we've rigged the ship to explode if they try to board, which will make them even more careful about not damaging anything." Through the viewing port, Zara watched the boarding party approach the ship's main airlock. They moved with the confidence of professional soldiers, but also with the caution of people who knew they were dealing with humans. Everyone in the galaxy had heard stories about what humans did when they were cornered. The airlock cycled, and the Void Hunters entered the ship. Jake sat perfectly still in the pilot's seat, his hands visible on the controls, appearing to be frozen with fear. It was a performance that would have been convincing even to Zara if she hadn't known it was an act. The boarding party leader entered the bridge with his weapon drawn, flanked by 2 other Void Hunters. When he saw Jake, his expression became one of satisfied triumph. "Human," he said in his heavily accented standard Galactic, "you will come with us. Do not attempt to resist." Jake turned slowly in the pilot's seat, his movements careful and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice carried just the right amount of fear and desperation. "You don't understand," he said. "There are civilians in the escape pods. If you take this ship, they'll die. The civilians will be preserved," the leader replied. "They are valuable cargo. You, however, are expendable unless you cooperate." Perfect, Zara thought. They had confirmed exactly what Jake had hoped. The Void Hunters were specifically hunting humans, and they wanted them alive. "What do you want from us?" Jake asked, maintaining his act of terrified cooperation. "That is not your concern," the leader said. "You will surrender yourself and order the civilians to exit the escape pods. Any resistance will result in immediate termination." Jake nodded slowly as if accepting defeat. "I'll need to use the ship's communication system to contact the pods." The leader gestured for him to proceed, while the other 2 Void Hunters moved to positions where they could watch both Jake and the corridor leading to the cargo bay. Everything was going exactly according to plan. Jake activated the ship's internal communication system and spoke in a voice that carried throughout the vessel. "Attention all passengers," he said. "We're being boarded by hostile forces. Prepare for emergency evacuation procedures." To the Void Hunters, it sounded like he was telling the people in the escape pods to prepare for capture. But Zara recognized the coded language from their earlier conversation. Jake was activating the ship's automated systems. Throughout the ship, she could hear the subtle sounds of machinery coming to life. Safety systems engaging, emergency protocols activating, and countdown timers beginning their inexorable march toward 0. "How long until the civilians emerge?" the leader demanded. 2 minutes, Jake replied. "The pods need time to cycle their airlocks safely." The leader spoke into his communication device, reporting their success to his ship. Zara could hear the satisfaction in his voice as he described the capture of multiple human prisoners, and the successful boarding of their escape vessel. But Jake wasn't done with his performance. As the seconds ticked by, he began to look increasingly nervous, glancing at displays and readouts as if something was going wrong. "What is the problem?" the leader demanded. "The escape pods," Jake said, his voice tight with apparent panic. "Something's wrong with their life support systems. They're showing critical failures." The leader moved to look at the displays Jake was indicating. What he saw there made his expression change from triumph to concern. The readouts showed multiple system failures throughout the ship, with particular problems in the cargo bay where the escape pods were located. "Fix it," the leader ordered. "I can't," Jake replied. "The systems are automated. If life support fails in the pods, the ship's safety protocols will automatically jettison them to prevent contamination of the main ship." It was a lie wrapped in enough technical truth to be convincing. The Void Hunters had no way of knowing that the life support failures were actually timer circuits counting down to detonation, or that the escape pods were actually mining charges rigged to explode. "How long do we have?" the leader asked. Jake checked a countdown display that he had programmed to show exactly what he wanted it to show. 30 seconds until automatic jettison." The leader immediately activated his communication device and began speaking rapidly to his ship. Zara couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. He was reporting an emergency and requesting immediate extraction. Through the bridge windows, she could see the Void Hunter transport ship moving closer to their position, preparing to retrieve the boarding party and their valuable prisoners before the contaminated escape pods were jettisoned into space. 20 seconds, Jake announced. The Void Hunters were becoming increasingly agitated, their leader shouting orders while the other two kept their weapons trained on Jake. None of them noticed that Jake's hands had moved to a secondary control panel, or that his fingers were resting on a series of switches that weren't part of the ship's original design. 10 seconds, Jake said. The Void Hunter transport was now close enough to the courier ship that Zara could see individual figures moving around inside its bridge. They were positioning themselves to recover the boarding party and secure the human prisoners they thought they were about to capture. 5 seconds, Jake announced, and then he smiled. It wasn't the nervous, frightened expression he had been wearing since the Void Hunters boarded. It was the cold, calculating smile of someone who had just sprung a trap that had been months in the planning. 0, he said, and activated the switches under his fingers. The explosion, when it came, was everything Jake had promised and more. The small transport ship looked innocent enough from the outside. Zara could see it through the docking bay's observation windows as they made their way through yet another maintenance corridor. It was a standard short-range vessel, the kind used for ferrying supplies between stations and nearby planets. Nothing about it suggested it could be used as a weapon, but Jake was studying it with the same intense focus he had shown when analyzing the station's systems. Antares-class courier, he said. Fusion drive, minimal armament but excellent maneuverability. And most importantly, it's designed to carry hazardous cargo. What kind of hazardous cargo? The kind that explodes if you don't handle it properly, Jake replied. Which means it has reinforced containment systems and emergency ejection mechanisms. Zara was beginning to understand how Jake's mind worked. He didn't see objects for what they were designed to do. He saw them for what they could be made to do. It was a fundamentally different way of thinking than what her people or most other species employed. You want to turn the ship into a bomb. Better than a bomb, Jake said. I want to turn it into a very precise delivery system for a very large explosion. They reached the docking bay access panel, and Jake immediately began working on the electronic locks. His improvised tools made quick work of the security systems, and soon they were inside the bay itself. The air was cold and thin, maintained at minimal life support levels to conserve power. The transport ship was larger up close than it had appeared through the windows. Its hull was scarred from years of use, but the systems appeared to be well maintained. Jake led them up the boarding ramp and into the ship's cramped interior. Can you fly this thing? Zara asked as she watched him examine the pilot's controls. Flying isn't the hard part, Jake said. The hard part is making sure we're not in it when it does what I need it to do. He was already deep in the ship's systems, calling up schematics and technical specifications on the main display. Zara tried to follow what he was doing, but the information was scrolling past too quickly for her to process. The ship's cargo bay is designed to carry concentrated fusion fuel, Jake explained as he worked. High energy density, extremely unstable if not properly contained. The safety systems are designed to eject the cargo into space if there's any risk of containment failure. Is there fusion fuel on board now? No, Jake said. But the safety systems don't know that. And the safety systems can be convinced that there's an imminent containment failure that requires immediate cargo ejection. His hands moved across the controls with increasing speed, programming commands that would have taken most people hours to understand. But Jake seemed to be working from pure instinct, as if he had been born knowing how to make machines do things they weren't supposed to do. The beauty of the plan, he continued, is that the Void Hunters will see us launch the ship and assume we're trying to escape. They'll either try to destroy us or capture us depending on how valuable they think we are. What happens when they realize we're not actually in the ship? Jake's smile was the expression of someone who had just solved a puzzle that everyone else thought was impossible. By then, the ship will be close enough to their command vessel to deliver its payload. What payload? You said there's no fusion fuel on board. There isn't, Jake agreed. But there are approximately 200 kilograms of high explosive mining charges in the station's emergency supply lockers. And mining charges, when properly arranged, can create a very impressive fireworks display. Zara stared at him in amazement and horror. You're going to pack the ship with explosives and fly it into their ship? Not fly it into their ship, Jake corrected. Fly it near their ship and then trigger the cargo ejection system. The charges will be ejected at high velocity directly toward their hull, and the proximity fuses will detonate them on impact. It was audacious, insane, and probably suicidal. It was also exactly the kind of plan that no rational species would ever attempt, which meant the Void Hunters would never see it coming. How do we get the explosives on board without being detected? We don't, Jake said. We let them think they're detecting something else entirely. He led her back through the ship to the cargo bay, which was indeed equipped with the kind of heavy-duty containment systems needed for hazardous materials. But instead of focusing on the containment systems, Jake began examining the life support connections. Emergency escape pods, he said, pointing to a series of panels along the cargo bay walls. If the ship's main life support fails, these panels open to reveal individual survival pods. Each pod has its own power, life support, and emergency beacon. Are we going to hide in the pods? Better than that, Jake said. We're going to convince the Void Hunters that we're hiding in the pods while we're actually somewhere completely different. He began opening the panels, revealing the compact escape pods inside. Each one was just large enough for a single person and equipped with everything needed to survive in space for several days. But Jake wasn't interested in their survival capabilities. He was interested in their electronic signatures. Each pod has an active life support system, he explained as he worked. To the Void Hunter's sensors, each pod will look like a person hiding in the cargo bay. They'll assume we're trying to use the pods as a way to escape after the ship is captured. But we won't actually be in the pods? No, Jake said. We'll be in the one place on the ship that no one ever looks because it's too obvious. Before Zara could ask where that might be, alarms began sounding throughout the docking bay. The Void Hunters had found them. Through the ship's viewports, they could see armored figures moving into the bay, their weapons raised and ready. But they weren't rushing toward the ship. They were taking up positions around it, preparing for a siege. They think we're trapped, Jake observed. That's good. It means they want us alive. How is that good? Because if they wanted us dead, they would have just blown up the ship, Jake said. Since they want us alive, they're going to try to capture us, and that means they're going to be very careful about not damaging what they think are escape pods, full of valuable prisoners. The lead Void Hunter stepped forward and activated an external communication system. When he spoke, his voice was amplified throughout the docking bay. Attention humans, he said in heavily accented Standard Galactic. You are surrounded. Surrender now and you will not be harmed. Resist and we will take you by force. Jake activated the ship's external communications and responded in a voice that was calm and completely unafraid. Counteroffer, he said. You leave the station immediately and we won't turn you and your ship into space debris. The Void Hunter's response was exactly what Jake had predicted. Harsh laughter that echoed through the bay, followed by orders to his troops to prepare for boarding action. They're going to try to take the ship, Zara said. Yes, Jake agreed. And when they do, they're going to get the surprise of their lives. He was already moving toward the ship's bridge, his improvised tools and equipment in hand. Time for Phase 2, he said. This is where things get interesting. The darkness in the hydroponics bay was absolute. Without the station's main power, even the emergency lighting had failed, leaving them in the kind of complete blackness that existed only in the void between stars. Zara's people had excellent night vision for underwater environments, but this was different. This was the absence of light itself, but Jake seemed unaffected by the darkness. She could hear him moving around the bay with the same confidence he had shown in the lighted corridors, his feet finding secure purchase on surfaces she couldn't even see. When he spoke, his voice came from directly beside her, though she hadn't heard him approach. Emergency power will be restored in approximately 4 minutes, he said quietly. The Void Hunters will assume they've stopped the evacuation, so they'll focus on searching for survivors instead of monitoring the power systems. How do you know that? Because that's what I would do, Jake replied. When you're hunting something, you don't waste time on secondary concerns. Zara felt something being pressed into her hands. It was smooth and warm, with the kind of weight that suggested sophisticated electronics. What is this? Portable life support monitor, Jake said. It will give us light and let us track atmospheric conditions. But more importantly, it will let us communicate with the station's emergency systems through the backup network. The device activated with a soft blue glow that seemed blindingly bright after the complete darkness. In its light, Zara could see that Jake had somehow gathered several pieces of equipment while moving through the blackness. Tools, spare components, and what looked like improvised weapons were laid out on the floor around them. Where did all this come from? Emergency supply caches, Jake said, as if it was obvious. Every section of the station has them. Most people don't know where they are because they assume someone else will handle emergencies. He was already working with the equipment, connecting components in ways that definitely weren't described in any manual. His hands moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from years of solving problems that weren't supposed to have solutions. What are you building? Communication array, Jake said. If we can't use the main systems to launch the escape pods, we'll use the backup systems. And if the backup systems won't work, we'll build our own systems. The device he was assembling looked like nothing Zara had seen before. It combined elements of standard communication equipment with improvised components that seemed to have been repurposed from completely unrelated systems. The result was something that no engineer would have designed, but which somehow looked like it might actually work. Will this really let us control the escape pods? Not control them, Jake said, but it will let us talk to them. And if we can talk to them, we can convince them that they need to launch. Before Zara could ask how they were going to convince machines to disobey their programming, emergency power flickered back to life. The bay was suddenly bathed in red light, and they could hear the station's systems coming back online throughout the complex. But they could also hear something else. Footsteps. Heavy armored footsteps moving through the corridors in organized patterns. The Void Hunters were conducting a systematic search, and they were getting closer. Jake's improvised communication device came to life with a series of soft beeps and status lights. Data began scrolling across a small display, showing the status of every escape pod on the station. Most were showing green lights indicating they were ready for launch. But they were also showing locked status, meaning the station's AI was still preventing their departure. Can you unlock them? Not from here, Jake said. But I don't need to unlock them. I just need to make them think they should unlock themselves. His fingers moved across the device's controls, sending signals that Zara couldn't interpret. But on the display, she could see the escape pods responding. Status lights began changing from red to yellow to green as systems activated throughout the station. What are you telling them? That there are people in the pods who need to be evacuated, Jake said. The AI's primary directive is to preserve life. If it thinks people are trapped in the pods during an emergency, it will override the security lockdown to save them. But there aren't people in the pods. Jake's smile was visible even in the red emergency lighting. The AI doesn't know that. It can only detect life signs, not where those life signs are located, and right now it's detecting dozens of life signs all over the station. The display showed escape pods beginning to launch throughout the station. One by one, the indicators changed from green to blue, as the small craft detached from their docking clamps and activated their emergency thrusters. In the distance, they could hear the Void Hunters shouting in their harsh language as they realized what was happening. They'll try to stop the launches, Zara said. Too late, Jake replied. The pods are already away. Even if they destroy some of them, most will escape. and once they're in open space, they'll automatically transmit distress signals to any nearby ships. But their celebration was premature. The footsteps in the corridor were getting closer, and Zara could now hear voices speaking in Standard Galactic. The Void Hunters had found prisoners, and they were using them as guides to search the station more efficiently. They have hostages, and she whispered. Jake's expression became something that made Zara understand why humans had developed such an effective reputation for violence, despite being physically weaker than most species. It wasn't anger or rage. It was the cold calculation of someone who had just been given a problem that required a very specific type of solution. How many hostages? I can hear at least 3 different voices, Zara said, her enhanced hearing picking up subtle variations in the sounds from the corridor. They sound terrified. Jake was already moving, gathering his improvised equipment and heading toward the bay's secondary exit. Then we're going to have to change the plan again. What do you mean? The Void Hunters are using prisoners to navigate the station, Jake said. That means they don't know the layout as well as they're pretending. And if they don't know the layout, they don't know about the emergency systems. He led her to what looked like a standard maintenance panel, but when he opened it, Zara could see that it contained far more complex systems than she had expected. Banks of switches, status lights, and control interfaces lined the interior of the panel. Emergency override controls, Jake explained. Every section of the station can be isolated and controlled independently if necessary. Life support, gravity, artificial atmosphere, even structural integrity can be adjusted from these panels. What are you planning to do? Jake's hands were already working across the controls, making adjustments that caused status lights to flicker and change throughout the panel. I'm going to give the Void Hunters a choice, he said. They can keep hunting for survivors, or they can deal with a station that's actively trying to kill them. As he worked, Zara could hear changes throughout the station. The steady hum of life support systems altered its pitch. Gravity fluctuated, causing loose objects to float momentarily before crashing back down. The lights flickered in patterns that seemed almost like a code. You're making the station unstable. No, Jake said. I'm making the station unpredictable. There's a difference. The station is still perfectly safe for anyone who knows what they're doing. But for invaders who don't understand the systems. Before he could finish the explanation, they heard a crash from somewhere in the station, followed by shouting in the Void Hunters' language. One of their groups had apparently triggered a safety system they hadn't expected. They're going to figure out what you're doing, Zara warned. Maybe, Jake agreed, but by then it won't matter, because we're not going to be here. He pointed to a section of the maintenance panel that showed a schematic of the station's docking bay. According to the display, there was still one ship attached to the station. It was small, probably a personal transport, but it was intact and showed active power systems. Is that our escape route? No, Jake said. That's our weapon. The maintenance shaft was getting cramped, and Zara's legs were starting to ache from crawling through spaces designed for repair drones rather than living beings. But Jake moved through the narrow passages like he had been born in them, his human flexibility allowing him to navigate turns and obstacles that would have stopped most other species. They had been moving for 20 minutes when Jake suddenly stopped and held up his hand for silence. Zara froze, her 3 hearts hammering as she strained to hear what had caught his attention. At first, there was nothing but the distant sound of energy weapons and the groaning of stressed metal. Then she heard it, voices speaking in the harsh, guttural language of the Void Hunters. Jake pressed himself against the side of the shaft and gestured for Zara to do the same. Through a maintenance grating, they could see into one of the station's laboratory sections. 3 Void Hunters in their distinctive black armor were searching through equipment, their movements efficient and purposeful. They weren't looking for valuables or technology to steal. They were looking for something specific. One of the Void Hunters spoke into a communication device, and even though Zara couldn't understand the words, the tone was clearly that of someone reporting a lack of success. The response from the device was sharp and angry, causing all 3 Void Hunters to stiffen with what looked like fear. They haven't found what they're looking for, Jake whispered, so quietly that Zara had to strain to hear him. How can you tell? Body language, Jake replied. Fear makes most species move the same way. They're scared of their commander. As they watched, the Void Hunters continued their search, becoming increasingly frantic. One of them picked up a piece of research equipment and smashed it against the wall in frustration. Another began pulling apart a computer terminal with his bare hands, scattering components across the floor. "They're getting desperate," Zara observed. "That's dangerous." "For them," Jake said. "Desperate people make mistakes." He was already moving again, leading them deeper into the maintenance system. Zara followed, trying to process what they had just witnessed. In her research on predatory behavior, she had learned that the most dangerous moment was when a predator became desperate. It was when they abandoned caution and strategy in favor of brute force. But humans, she was beginning to realize, had a different relationship with desperation. They seemed to get more focused when things became hopeless, not less. They emerged from the maintenance shaft in what had once been the station's hydroponics bay. The plants that had provided fresh food for the crew were now withered and dying, their growth systems damaged by the attack. The smell of dying vegetation mixed with the acrid odor of electrical fires created an atmosphere that made Zara's gills burn. Jake moved to a control panel and began typing commands with practiced efficiency. "The reactor control room is directly above us," he said. "But there's a problem. More void hunters? Worse, the control room's in lockdown mode. Blast doors are sealed, life support is cut off, and the automated defenses are active. Whoever's in there is either dead or wishing they were." Zara felt her hope beginning to fade. "Then how do we get to the reactor controls?" Jake's fingers continued working across the panel, bringing up schematics and system readouts that meant nothing to Zara but seemed to tell him everything he needed to know. "We don't go to the reactor controls," he said. "We bring the reactor controls to us." He pointed to a section of the schematic that showed a complex web of connections between the hydroponics bay and the reactor control room. "Emergency backup systems," he explained. "If the main control room is compromised, critical functions can be rerouted through secondary terminals. The designers built redundancy into everything because space stations have a habit of trying to kill everyone on board. Can you access the reactor from here?" "Not exactly," Jake said, his expression taking on that disturbing smile again. "But I can access the backup life support systems. And the backup life support systems are connected to the reactor monitoring network. And the reactor monitoring network thinks that a sudden drop in life support efficiency means there's been a catastrophic system failure." Zara stared at him as the implications became clear. "You're going to trick the computer into thinking the reactor is failing by making it think life support is failing." "Close," Jake said. "I'm going to make life support actually fail in specific sections of the station. The computer will detect the cascade failure, pattern, and initiate emergency protocols to prevent a reactor overload that isn't actually happening. It was a plan that required understanding dozens of interconnected systems and predicting exactly how the station's AI would respond to a complex emergency scenario. It was the kind of plan that would take most species hours of careful calculation and simulation to develop. Jake was putting it together in real time while void hunters searched for them through the station. "How do you know this will work?" Zara asked. "I don't," Jake admitted. "But humans have a saying. When you can't go around a problem, you go through it. And when you can't go through it, you trick it into solving itself." His hands moved across the control interface, making adjustments to systems throughout the station. Zara watched displays showing life support efficiency, dropping in carefully selected sections, creating a pattern that looked exactly like the kind of cascade failure that preceded reactor meltdowns. "How long will this take?" "The AI should detect the pattern in about 5 minutes, Jake said. "It will spend 2 minutes running diagnostics to confirm the threat is real. Then it will have exactly 90 seconds to either fix the problem or initiate emergency evacuation protocols. And if it chooses to fix the problem instead of evacuating," Jake's smile became something that made Zara understand why humans had survived and thrived on a world full of creatures specifically designed to hunt and kill them. "Then we'll be in the same situation we're in now, except with worse life support." The wait was agonizing. Zara found herself counting her heartbeats and trying to calculate how much oxygen they had left in the damaged hydroponics bay. Jake seemed completely calm, monitoring the station's systems and making small adjustments to maintain the illusion of impending disaster. Then the alarms changed. Instead of the steady warning tone they had been hearing, a new alarm began sounding. This one was faster, more urgent, with a rhythm that seemed designed to induce panic in anyone who heard it. "Critical system failure detected," the station's AI announced. "Reactor containment breach imminent. All personnel to emergency evacuation pods immediately. Automated launch sequence will commence in T-minus 8 minutes. Through the bay's damaged viewport, Zara could see the running lights of escape pods beginning to activate throughout the station. The AI was preparing to launch every pod simultaneously, regardless of whether anyone was in them. It worked, she breathed. Phase 1 worked, Jake corrected. Now comes the hard part. Before Zara could ask what he meant, the lights went out again. But this time they didn't come back on. Emergency power flickered for a moment, then died completely. The station was now running on backup power only, and even that was failing. In the darkness, Zara heard Jake's voice, calm and steady. The Void Hunters just cut main power to stop the evacuation sequence. They know it's a trick. What do we do now? There was a long pause. Then Jake's voice came again, and there was something in it that made Zara's blood run cold. Now we do this the human way. Jake's fingers stopped moving across the control interface, and the screens showed exactly what Zara had feared. Red indicators marked pod after pod as either damaged, destroyed, or already launched. The Void Hunters had been thorough in their attack, targeting the escape routes first to prevent anyone from calling for help. 17 pods left, Jake said, his voice carrying that strange human quality that stayed calm even when delivering terrible news. Problem is, there are 43 life signs still active on the station. Zara felt her gills flutter with anxiety. On her world, when resources were scarce, the decision was simple. The strongest swimmers survived while the weak were left behind. It was brutal but logical. But humans, she had learned from her research, had different ideas about survival. We launch what we can, she said, trying to sound practical. 17 people is better than none. Jake turned to look at her with those strange, forward-facing eyes that seemed to see right through her. That's not how we do things. Before Zara could ask what he meant, the lights went out completely. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in the red glow that made Jake's face look like something from her people's deep-water nightmares. In the distance, they could hear the sound of heavy footsteps and the harsh barking language of the Void Hunters. "They're in the station," Zara whispered, her throat sacs contracting with fear. "We need to go now." But Jake was already moving, pulling open panels she hadn't even noticed and exposing cables and circuit boards underneath. His hands moved with the kind of confidence that came from years of working with machinery, and Zara realized that his maintenance uniform wasn't just for show. He actually knew how to fix things. "The pods aren't damaged," he said as he worked. "They're locked down by the station's security AI. Standard protocol when the station is boarded prevents prisoners from escaping." "Then how do we unlock them?" Jake's smile was the most terrifying thing Zara had ever seen. It wasn't cruel or angry like the expressions of natural predators. It was worse. It was the smile of someone who had just figured out how to do something that everyone else would consider impossible. "We don't unlock them," he said, pulling out what looked like a small explosive device from his toolkit. "We convince the AI that the station has been abandoned and needs to initiate emergency evacuation protocols." "How do we do that?" "We blow up the main reactor control room." Zara stared at him in horror. "That will kill everyone on the station." "No," Jake said patiently, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "That will make the AI think the reactor is going critical. The safety protocols will automatically launch all remaining pods to minimum safe distance before the supposed explosion. Everyone gets out, and we buy ourselves about 20 minutes before the Void Hunters figure out we tricked them." It was insane. It was reckless. It was exactly the kind of plan that no rational species would ever consider. It was also brilliant. "The reactor control room is on level 7, Zara said, her scientific mind already working through the logistics. "That's where the Void Hunters landed. They'll have guards posted." "Probably," Jake agreed, checking his toolkit with the same calm efficiency he had shown with the controls. "But they'll be watching for people trying to escape, not someone stupid enough to run toward the most dangerous part of the station." He handed her a small device that looked like a communications unit. "This is a proximity detonator. When we get within 50 meters of the control room, it will set off the charges I'm going to place. The explosion will be small, but it will trigger the right sensor readings to fool the AI." Zara took the device with trembling fingers. "What if the guards see us?" Jake's expression became something that made her understand why humans had become apex predators on their world, despite being physically weaker than most of their competition. Then we deal with them. They made their way through the station's maintenance corridors, moving through spaces that most other species couldn't even fit into. Jake seemed to know every shortcut and hidden passage, leading them through a maze of pipes and cables that bypassed the main corridors where the Void Hunters were patrolling. The sounds of the invasion grew louder as they moved deeper into the station. Zara could hear the distinctive energy weapons of the Void Hunters and the return fire from the station's security forces, but she could also hear something else: screaming. Not the quick, clean death that combat usually brought, but the prolonged agony of people being tortured for information. "They're looking for something," Jake said quietly, as they paused at a junction between two maintenance shafts. "Void Hunters don't usually bother with prisoners unless there's something specific they want." Zara thought about her research on human behavioral patterns, and a terrible possibility occurred to her. What if they're looking for humans? Jake's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Why would they want humans? Specifically? "Your people are new to the galactic community," Zara said, trying to organize her thoughts. "There are species that would pay enormous amounts for live human specimens. For research, for entertainment, for worse things." She watched Jake's face as he processed this information. Most species would have shown fear or anger or desperation, but Jake's expression became something that Zara's research had never adequately captured. It wasn't any single emotion. It was the look of someone who had just been given a very specific problem to solve and was already working through the solutions. "How many humans are on this station?" he asked. 12, according to the personnel manifest. 11 now, Jake said. Dr. Peterson was in Section 4 when they breached. I saw his pod launch before the lockdown. That meant 10 humans were still somewhere on the station, probably hiding or already captured. And if Zara was right about what the Void Hunters wanted, those 10 people were about to experience something far worse than a quick death. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Zara could practically see him thinking. Finally, he reached into his toolkit and pulled out several more of the small explosive devices. "Change of plans," he said. "We're still going to trigger the evacuation protocols, but we're going to do it the hard way." "What do you mean?" Jake's smile returned, and this time Zara understood why so many species found humans deeply unsettling. "We're going to make sure the Void Hunters have bigger problems to worry about than catching humans." Before Zara could ask what he meant, alarms began blaring throughout the station. But these weren't the evacuation alarms they had been hearing. These were different, deeper, more urgent. "Hull breach in Section 8, the station's AI announced. "Emergency containment protocols activated. All personnel evacuate immediately." Jake tilted his head, listening to something Zara couldn't hear. "That's not a hull breach," he said finally. "That's a Void Hunter transport trying to dock. They're bringing in more troops." The situation had just gone from desperate to hopeless. But instead of looking defeated, Jake seemed almost pleased by this development. Zara's 3 hearts were beating so fast she thought they might burst from her chest. The emergency klaxon echoed through the corridors of the Galactic Research Station Kepler 7, and red warning lights painted everything in crimson shadows. Her elongated blue fingers trembled as she clutched the datapad containing months of her research on human behavioral patterns. The station was under attack by Void Hunters, ruthless pirates who left nothing but empty hulks floating in space. Everyone knew the stories. No survivors, no mercy, just death in the cold vacuum claiming another victory. "All personnel to emergency pods immediately," the station's AI announced in its calm, mechanical voice that seemed terribly inappropriate for their current situation. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Zara's webbed feet slapped against the metal flooring as she ran down Corridor C7, her research bag bouncing against her hip. As a xenobiologist from the water world of Aquanus, she wasn't built for running on solid ground. Her people were graceful swimmers, but on land, they moved like clumsy amphibians trying to remember how legs worked. Behind her, she could hear the distant sounds of hull breaches and the terrible screaming of metal being torn apart. The Void Hunters had broken through the outer defenses faster than anyone had expected. The station's security forces were fighting desperately, but everyone knew it was hopeless. Kepler-7 was a research facility, not a military outpost. She turned the corner leading to the emergency pod bay and immediately saw the problem. A massive piece of debris had crashed through the ceiling, blocking the main entrance. Sparks flew from severed power cables, and the acrid smell of burning electronics filled the air. Other researchers and station personnel were clustered around the blocked entrance, their various alien features twisted with panic and desperation. "The secondary bay," someone shouted. "We can reach the secondary bay through the maintenance tunnels." But Zara knew they didn't have time. The maintenance tunnels were on the other side of the station, and the Void Hunters were moving fast. She had studied their tactics extensively as part of her research into predatory behavior patterns. They would secure the station section by section, eliminating any resistance they found. That's when she remembered the human quarters. Humans were relatively new to the Galactic Council, having joined only 50 years ago. Most species still didn't understand them very well. They were physically weaker than most races, couldn't breathe underwater like her people, didn't have the natural armor of the Rocklings, and lacked the telepathic abilities of the Mindweavers. What they did have was something most other species found disturbing and unpredictable: an absolute refusal to give up when things looked hopeless. The human section of the station was in the opposite direction from where everyone else was fleeing. It was also where the emergency manual controls for the escape pods were located, a backup system installed because humans insisted on having manual overrides for everything. "Never trust a computer with your life," they always said, which other species found paranoid and primitive. Zara made a decision that her rational mind screamed was insane. Instead of following the crowd toward the blocked entrance, she turned and ran toward the human quarters. Her bag slipped from her shoulder as she moved, but she didn't stop to retrieve it. The research inside had taken her 3 years to compile, but it would be useless if she was dead. The human section was eerily quiet compared to the chaos everywhere else. Emergency lighting cast long shadows between the living quarters, and Zara could smell something distinctly human in the air. It was a scent she had never been able to classify properly in her research, something that seemed to combine determination, coffee, and an odd chemical signature that her people's enhanced olfactory systems picked up as dangerous optimism. She was looking for Dr. Marcus Chen, the station's human liaison, and one of the few people who had been kind to her during her research. Humans had a reputation for being social with other species, but Zara had always been too shy to take advantage of it. Now she wished she had made more of an effort to understand them. She found the manual pod controls exactly where the station schematics said they would be, behind a panel marked with warnings in 17 different languages. The human warning was typically direct: emergency use only. Touching this will probably kill you. Other species would have added detailed explanations about proper procedures and safety protocols. Humans just told you it was dangerous and assumed you were smart enough to figure out the rest. But the controls were locked behind a biometric scanner designed for human DNA signatures. Zara stared at the scanner in frustration, her 3 hearts sinking. She had come all this way for nothing. The manual controls were useless without a human to operate them. That's when she heard the footsteps behind her. She spun around, expecting to see Void Hunters, but instead found herself looking at a single human. He was tall by her people's standards, with the strange hair that grew from their heads in brown waves and the forward-facing eyes that marked them as natural predators. He was wearing the gray uniform of station maintenance, not the blue of research staff, and there was something in his expression that made Zara's survival instincts. "Trigger warning signals, you're going the wrong way," he said in the oddly flat tone that humans used when they were stating obvious facts. "Everyone else is trying to get to the pod bay." Zara's throat sacs fluttered nervously the way her people showed stress. "The pod bay is blocked," she managed to say in standard Galactic. "I thought maybe the manual controls." The human stepped closer and Zara instinctively took a step backward. There was something about the way he moved that reminded her of the deep-sea predators from her homeworld. Smooth, controlled, and absolutely certain of their place in the food chain. "Smart," he said, and she couldn't tell if he was surprised or impressed. Most people panic and follow the crowd. "You think like a survivor." He placed his hand on the biometric scanner and it immediately flashed green. The manual controls came online with a soft chime that seemed absurdly cheerful given their circumstances. Data scrolled across multiple screens showing the status of every escape pod on the station. "What's your name?" he asked as his fingers moved across the control interface with practiced efficiency. "Zara," she replied, watching him work. "Zara Deepcurrent of the Aquinas Research Collective." "Jake Morrison," he said without looking up from the controls. "And we've got a problem." The mining charges detonated in a sequence that Jake had calculated down to the microsecond. First, the cargo bay's emergency ejection system activated, launching the disguised explosives toward the Void Hunter transport ship at tremendous velocity. Then, just as the charges reached optimal proximity to their target, the proximity fuses triggered a cascade of explosions that turned the night of space into brilliant day. The Void Hunter transport ship, designed for raiding lightly defended research stations, had no defense against 200 kilograms of high explosives detonating against its hull. The vessel's armor cracked like an eggshell, and atmosphere vented into space in glittering streams of frozen gases. But Jake's plan had been more sophisticated than simply destroying the enemy ship. The explosion had been precisely positioned to disable the transport's engines and weapons, while leaving its life support and communication systems intact. The Void Hunters were stranded but alive, and their distress signals would soon bring rescue ships to investigate. "Why didn't you destroy them completely?" Zara asked as they watched the crippled ship drifting helplessly in space. "Because dead pirates can't spread stories," Jake replied. "But pirates who barely survived an encounter with humans will tell everyone they meet about what happened here." The 3 Void Hunters who had boarded their ship were unconscious but alive, having been stunned by Jake's improvised, non-lethal weapons during the confusion of the explosion. He had tied them up with restraint cables and left them in the cargo bay where they would be found when rescue ships arrived. "You planned all of this from the beginning," Zara said. "It wasn't a question." "Not all of it," Jake admitted. "I had to adapt when circumstances changed. But the basic principle was always the same. When someone tries to hunt you, you make them regret it." They were back in the station's command center now, using the restored main power to coordinate rescue operations for the escaped personnel. The escape pods that Jake had tricked the AI into launching were being recovered by ships that had responded to the automated distress signals. "How? Did you know the Void Hunters would respond the way they did?" Zara asked. "Because I understand predators," Jake said. "My people spent thousands of years being hunted by creatures that were stronger, faster, and better armed than we were. We survived by learning to think like they did, and then using that knowledge against them." Zara thought about her own research into human behavioral patterns, and suddenly many of the puzzling aspects of human psychology began to make sense. Your entire species learned to think like predators even though you're not natural predators yourselves. "We're not natural anything," Jake said. "We're persistence hunters who learn to use tools, social cooperation, and pattern recognition to overcome physical limitations. When you can't outfight something, you outthink it." The rescue operations continued for several hours. Ships from 3 different systems had responded to the distress signals, and the station's personnel were being safely evacuated to various destinations throughout the sector. The research facility itself was a total loss, but everyone who had been trapped there was alive and free. Zara found herself staying close to Jake throughout the evacuation process. She told herself it was because he seemed to know what was happening and how to help, but she was beginning to suspect there were other reasons as well. "What will you do now?" she asked as they watched the last of the rescue ships docking with the station. "Report to human authorities," Jake said. "This attack was specifically targeting humans, which means there's a larger threat that needs to be addressed. Someone is paying the Void Hunters to capture our people, and we need to find out who and why." And after that, Jake turned to look at her with those strange forward-facing eyes that seemed to see everything. "I haven't decided yet. My original assignment was to maintain the station's systems and provide technical support to the research staff, but there might not be a station to maintain anymore." Zara made a decision that surprised her with its suddenness. "I want to continue my research," she said, "my work on human behavioral patterns, but I need a human subject to study." "The universities on Earth would be happy to provide research subjects," Jake said. "Human volunteers are eager to help with xenobiological studies." "No," Zara said. "I need a specific human subject, one who has demonstrated the full range of human adaptive behaviors under extreme stress conditions." Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Zara wondered if she had misunderstood something about human social customs. Then he smiled, and this time it wasn't the cold, calculating expression she had seen during their escape. It was warm and genuinely pleased. "Are you asking me to be your research subject?" "I'm asking you to be my partner," Zara said. "In research, and in whatever comes after the research is finished." It was a proposal that would have been impossible for her to make just a few days earlier. Her people were naturally cautious about forming bonds with other species, preferring the safety of familiar relationships. But Jake had shown her that sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the most rewarding. "There's something you should know," Jake said. "Humans don't make good research subjects. We have a tendency to change our behavior when we know we're being studied." "I'm counting on it," Zara replied. "I want to see what happens when a human knows someone is watching and decides to be impressive. Anyway." Jake's laugh was the sound of someone who had just realized that his carefully planned escape had led him somewhere he hadn't expected to go. "In that case," he said, "I accept your proposal. But I have one condition." "What condition?" "Next time we're trapped on a space station with hostile borders, you get to come up with the plan." Zara's throat sacs fluttered with what her people called joy laughter. "Deal," she said. "But I warn you, my people's approach to problem solving is very different from yours." "How different?" "When we can't solve a problem by thinking our way through it," Zara said, "we swim around it until we find a current that carries us where we need to go." Jake considered this for a moment. "That actually sounds like it might work," he said. "Humans spend so much time fighting against the current that we sometimes forget there might be easier ways to reach our destination." As they spoke, a new ship was approaching the station. Unlike the rescue vessels that had been arriving all day, this one was sleek and fast, with the distinctive markings of human military forces. Jake's expression became serious as he watched it approach. "That's a problem," he said. "Why?" "Because human military doesn't usually respond to civilian emergencies," Jake said. "If they're here, it means they've classified this incident as something bigger than a pirate raid." The ship docked with practiced efficiency, and within minutes a team of humans in military uniforms was aboard the station. Their leader was a woman with the bearing and confidence that marked her as someone accustomed to command. "Mr. Morrison," she said when she reached the command center. "I'm Colonel Martinez, Human Defense Corps. We need to talk." Jake nodded as if he had been expecting this. "I assume this is about the Void Hunter's interest in capturing humans alive." "Among other things," Colonel Martinez said. Her gaze shifted to Zara. "Dr. Deepcurrent, your research on human behavioral patterns has been classified as strategically important to human security. We're prepared to offer you full funding and access to any resources you need to continue your work." Zara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's damaged life support systems. "What exactly do you want me to research?" Colonel Martinez's smile was polite but cold. "We want to understand why every other species in the galaxy is suddenly very interested in studying humans. And we want to make sure that when they do study us, they learn exactly what we want them to learn." Jake and Zara exchanged glances, and Zara realized that their adventure was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. She had slipped, landed on a human, and somehow found herself saying, "I'm staying," without words. Now she was about to discover exactly what that decision would mean. But as she looked at Jake's expression, she realized she wasn't worried about the future. Humans, she had learned, were very good at handling impossible situations, and she was no longer facing the impossible alone.